The rain came down in sheets that March afternoon in 1944, hammering the windows of the briefing room at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force like machine gun fire. Inside, 43 officers sat around a massive oak table covered in maps of the French coast. Every man in that room knew what those maps meant. In 3 months, they would ask tens of thousands of young men to storm those beaches. Many would never come home. General Lawrence Mitchell stood by the window, only half listening to the British colonel droning on about tide tables and moon phases. At 52, Mitchell carried himself with the rigid confidence of a man who'd spent 3 decades in uniform and believed he'd seen everything worth seeing. 6 weeks ago, he'd arrived in England from the Pacific Theatre, where he'd commanded artillery units against the Japanese. He found Europe softer than the Pacific. Too much protocol, too much politics, too many allies who needed their hands held. Outside, a column of soldiers marched past in the rain. Even through the streaked glass, their uniforms were unmistakable, Canadian. Mitchell recognized the distinctive wedge caps, those peculiar pieces of headgear that sat at an angle on their heads, looking like something between a garrison cap and a beret, but managing to be neither. He watched them march in perfect formation, their boots splashing through puddles, rifles on shoulders, and then, loud enough for everyone in the room to hear, Mitchell said it. "Look at those stupid hats." The briefing stopped. The British colonel's voice died mid-sentence. 42 pairs of eyes turned toward the window, then toward Mitchell. He didn't notice. He was smiling, genuinely amused by what he considered an absurd piece of military millinery. "What kind of army lets its soldiers wear something that ridiculous into combat?" Mitchell laughed. It was a short bark of amusement, the kind of laugh that expected others to join in, the kind that assumed everyone shared the joke. Nobody laughed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, dense with shock and disbelief. The kind of silence that happens when someone crosses a line they didn't know existed, when words hang in the air like smoke from a gun that can't be unfired. 4 Canadian officers sat at the far end of the table. They went very still. Their faces showed nothing, but their shoulders tightened, their jaws set. Anyone paying attention would have recognized the body language of men holding back fury through sheer force of will. The British officers looked embarrassed, their eyes dropping to their papers. The American officers suddenly found the maps in front of them absolutely fascinating. Someone coughed. Someone else shifted in their chair. The sound of rain against the windows seemed to grow louder. Mitchell finally noticed the silence. He turned from the window, still smiling, expecting to see others sharing his amusement. Instead, he saw faces carefully arranged into neutral expressions. He saw the British colonel staring at him with something like horror. He saw his fellow Americans studying their fingernails. And he saw the 4 Canadians watching him with eyes like ice. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered across Mitchell's face, uncertainty, a brief recognition that perhaps he'd misjudged the room, but his pride was stronger than his awareness. Instead of retreating, he doubled down. "I mean, seriously, what are those things? They look like someone couldn't decide between a beret and a proper service cap, so they just made something halfway between." He gestured toward the window where the Canadian column was disappearing around a corner. "No wonder the Germans don't take you seriously." That last comment shattered the silence. Colonel James Harrison stood up. He did it slowly, deliberately, like a man who needed to be very careful about his next actions, or he might do something he'd regret. At 47, Harrison had spent more than half his life in uniform. He'd been at Vimy Ridge in 1917, had the scars to prove it, including the pale line that ran down his left cheek where shrapnel had opened his face to the bone. His hair was steel grey. His eyes were the blue of a winter sky, and right now they were absolutely frigid. 27 years of military discipline held him in check. 27 years of professionalism kept his voice level when he spoke. "General Mitchell?" 2 words, perfectly polite, perfectly controlled, and absolutely terrifying in their restraint. Mitchell turned to face him, still not understanding the magnitude of his error. "Those stupid hats you're referring to," Harrison continued, each word precise as a surgeon's cut, "are wedge caps, part of the Canadian battle dress uniform. They've been worn by Canadian soldiers since 1939. He paused, letting that sink in. "The men wearing them have been fighting this war for 5 years, which is approximately 4 years longer than American forces have been engaged in Europe." Another pause. "Longer this time." "Longer. Perhaps before you criticize what they wear, General, you should consider what they've accomplished while wearing it." Mitchell's smile faded. This wasn't going the way he'd expected. He'd made what he thought was a harmless observation, a bit of casual military humor. Instead, he was being lectured by a colonel who seemed to think Mitchell had committed some kind of offense. "Colonel, I didn't mean any offense," Mitchell started, his tone suggesting he thought Harrison was being overly sensitive. "I'm just saying, from a practical standpoint, those caps look impractical for combat. Our helmets provide protection. British caps are at least dignified, but those wedge things look like something a bellhop would wear." Another Canadian officer rose to his feet, Lieutenant Colonel Robert MacDonald. At 39, he'd already fought through Sicily and up the Italian peninsula. He had the lean, hard look of a man who'd spent too many nights sleeping in foxholes and too many days watching friends die. His voice, when he spoke, could have frozen water. "General Mitchell, Canadian forces have been in continuous combat operations since 1939. We fought in France, we fought in England during the Blitz, we fought in the Atlantic, we fought in Sicily, we fought in Italy, and we'll be at the forefront of the invasion you're all planning." MacDonald's hands were flat on the table, knuckles white. "Throughout all of that, we've worn our stupid hats, as you call them, and somehow we've managed to accomplish our missions effectively." The British liaison officer, Colonel Peaton, decided to intervene before this escalated into something that couldn't be walked back. He'd worked extensively with Canadian forces. He knew what they'd endured, what they'd achieved, and he recognized that Mitchell had just insulted men who'd earned the right to be insulted by no one. "General Mitchell," Peaton said smoothly, diplomatically, "perhaps we should return to the briefing agenda. I'm sure the General meant no disrespect to our Canadian colleagues." It was a perfect exit, a graceful way for Mitchell to back down, apologize, and move on. Any experienced coalition officer would have taken it. Mitchell didn't take it. "I'm just making an observation," he said, his stubbornness overriding his judgment. "If we're going to fight together effectively, we should be honest about what works and what doesn't. And those caps don't work from a military standpoint." Harrison's jaw tightened. The scar on his cheek went white. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper, but it cut through the room like a blade. "General Mitchell, General, with all due respect, you've been in theatre for approximately 6 weeks. You've observed one training exercise. You have not yet been in combat in this theatre." He leaned forward, palms on the table. "The Canadian forces you're criticizing have been fighting for 5 years. We have established a reputation for effectiveness that speaks for itself. Your opinion on our uniforms is noted, General, but frankly, it's irrelevant." The word irrelevant landed like a slap. Harrison's verdict hung in the air between them, final and damning. The meeting broke up shortly after. Harrison gathered his papers with deliberate precision. So did MacDonald. So did the other 2 Canadian officers whose names Mitchell hadn't bothered to learn. "I believe," Harrison said quietly, "that we're done here for today." It wasn't a suggestion. It was a statement of fact. The 4 Canadians walked out. Their footsteps echoed in the silent room. The door closed behind them with a sound like a coffin lid. The briefing was over. The critical planning session for D-Day, the meeting that was supposed to coordinate Allied efforts for the most important invasion in human history, had just collapsed because an American general couldn't keep his mouth shut about a hat. Word spread through Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force the way wildfire spreads through dry grass. By dinner, everyone knew. The American general who'd insulted Canadian headgear. The confrontation with Colonel Harrison. The collapse of the briefing. In the officers' mess, conversation stopped when Mitchell entered. In the hallways, people found reasons to be elsewhere when they saw him coming. By evening, Mitchell had become professionally radioactive, and he still didn't fully grasp why. At 1900 hours, General Dwight Eisenhower sat in his office receiving the evening briefing from his Chief of Staff. They were working through routine items when the Chief of Staff paused. "Sir, there's one more thing. It's about General Mitchell." Eisenhower looked up from the report he'd been reading. He'd met Mitchell briefly when the man arrived from the Pacific. Competent artillery officer, good technical skills, a bit rough around the edges. What about him? There was an incident at this afternoon's planning meeting. Eisenhower put down his pen. The word incident at a planning meeting 3 months before D-Day was never good news. "What kind of incident?" the Chief of Staff told him. Every detail. Mitchell's comment about stupid hats, the escalation, Harrison's response, the collapsed briefing. Eisenhower's face went through several expressions in rapid succession: surprise, disbelief, anger. By the time the Chief of Staff finished, Eisenhower was on his feet, pacing behind his desk like a caged animal. He said, "What?" "According to multiple witnesses, sir, he called Canadian wedge caps stupid hats and suggested they made Canadian forces look ridiculous. When confronted, he doubled down and suggested the Germans don't take Canadian forces seriously." Jesus Christ. Eisenhower rarely swore, but this deserved it. He was trying to hold together a coalition of American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces. He was managing egos, national pride, competing strategic visions, and 1,000 other political complications while planning the largest amphibious invasion in history. And now one of his generals had decided to insult one of America's most important allies over a piece of headgear. "Get me Mitchell's personnel file," Eisenhower ordered, "and schedule a meeting with him for tomorrow morning, 0700. Also find out which Canadian officers were in that room. I need to do damage control." The file arrived 20 minutes later. Eisenhower read it with growing concern. General Lawrence Mitchell, age 52, 28 years of service, competent record in artillery command, multiple combat commendations from the Pacific Theater, but there, buried in the fitness reports and transfer records, was a pattern, transferred from a joint command position with Australian forces in 1943. Reason listed as organizational restructuring, but the note suggested personality conflicts. Before that, issues working with Free French forces in North Africa in 1942. One fitness report, diplomatically worded, described Mitchell as having difficulty working effectively in coalition environments. The pattern was clear. Mitchell was technically proficient but culturally tone-deaf. He didn't work well with non-American forces. He had opinions about how things should be done, and those opinions didn't leave much room for other perspectives. Eisenhower spent the next hour making phone calls. He spoke to Colonel Harrison personally, offering apologies without making excuses. He spoke to the Canadian military attaché. He spoke to his British counterparts. Everyone was professional, but he could hear the anger underneath the politeness. The Canadians had been fighting this war since 1939. They'd suffered heavy casualties, they'd proven themselves in battle again and again, and some American general who'd been in Europe for 6 weeks had just told them they looked ridiculous. At 2200 hours, alone in his office, Eisenhower made a decision. Mitchell couldn't be allowed to poison Allied cooperation, but simply sending him home would look like America didn't take the insult seriously. This needed to be a lesson. General Lawrence Mitchell reported to Eisenhower's office at 06:55, 5 minutes early as regulations required. He'd spent a restless night, his confidence slowly eroding as he replayed the confrontation with Harrison. Maybe he'd been too blunt, maybe he should have phrased it differently. Eisenhower kept him waiting until exactly 0700. When Mitchell was finally shown in, Eisenhower didn't stand, didn't shake hands, didn't offer coffee or a seat. "General Mitchell, I understand you made some comments yesterday about Canadian uniforms. Tell me exactly what you said and why you thought it was appropriate. No preamble, no pleasantries. Just a direct question delivered in a tone that suggested Eisenhower already knew the answer and didn't like it. Mitchell felt the first real stab of fear. "Sir, I was just pointing out that Canadian headgear looks odd and probably isn't effective for combat purposes. It was an observation about military efficiency, not a personal attack." "You called their hats stupid." It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact, delivered flat and cold. "In front of Canadian officers," Eisenhower continued, "and when confronted, you suggested that the Germans don't take Canadian forces seriously because of those hats." "I may have phrased it poorly, sir." "You phrased it disastrously." Eisenhower stood now, but not to shake hands. He stood because sitting still would have required more self-control than he currently possessed. "Let me explain something to you, General. The Canadian forces you insulted have been fighting this war since September 1939. They've been in continuous combat operations for 5 years. 5 years. They've fought in every major campaign in this theatre. They're planning to land at Normandy with a full division, and they'll be fighting through France and into Germany alongside our forces." He paused, making sure Mitchell was paying attention. "Those stupid hats you mocked, they've been worn by men who stormed beaches in Sicily, who fought through Italian mountains, who will be landing at Juno Beach in a few months. Those hats represent a military tradition and a fighting force that has earned respect through blood and sacrifice." Mitchell opened his mouth to respond. Eisenhower raised a hand, cutting him off. "More importantly, General, we're fighting a coalition war. That means managing relationships with Allied forces in ways that maintain mutual respect and cooperation. When you insult Canadian uniforms, you're not just making a fashion critique. You're undermining Allied unity. You're creating unnecessary friction in a command structure that needs to work together seamlessly for the invasion to succeed." "Sir, I understand, but—" "No buts, General. Here's what's going to happen." Eisenhower picked up a folder from his desk. "You're going to write a formal apology to the Canadian officers who were in that meeting. You're going to meet with them personally and express your regret for your comments. And you're going to spend the next month working as a liaison officer with Canadian forces, specifically the 3rd Canadian Infantry Division. You'll be embedded with them. You'll observe their training. You'll learn about their capabilities, their history, and their contributions to this war effort." Mitchell's face showed his shock. A month embedded with Canadian forces? As a liaison officer? That was a demotion in all but name, a public humiliation. "Sir, with respect—" "And General," Eisenhower interrupted, his voice dropping to something quiet and absolutely lethal, "if I hear about any more incidents of you insulting Allied forces, you'll be on a ship back to the States so fast you won't have time to pack. We're fighting the Germans, not each other. Remember that." The meeting was over. Mitchell stood at attention, his career hanging by a thread, finally understanding the full magnitude of what he'd done. Dismissed, Mitchell saluted, turned, and walked out on legs that felt like water. The room was small, deliberately so. 4 Canadian officers sat on one side of a plain wooden table. General Lawrence Mitchell stood on the other, a sheet of paper trembling slightly in his hands. It was 1600 hours. Mitchell had spent the morning writing and rewriting the apology, each draft sounding more hollow than the last. Now he stood before the men he'd insulted, reading words that felt like ash in his mouth. "I deeply regret my comments regarding Canadian military uniforms. My remarks were inappropriate, unprofessional, and disrespectful to the distinguished service record of Canadian forces. I apologize unreservedly." He looked up. Colonel James Harrison sat directly across from him, face carved from stone. Lieutenant Colonel Robert MacDonald was to Harrison's right, arms folded. The other two officers watched him with expressions that gave away nothing. Silence stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Finally, Harrison spoke. "Your apology is noted, General Mitchell. We accept it with the understanding that you will be joining us for the next month to better understand Canadian military operations." Or, the words were correct. The tone was Arctic. "We expect you at 3rd Division headquarters tomorrow morning at 0600. Major Mackenzie will be your handler. He'll ensure you get the full educational experience." The emphasis on educational made it sound like a threat. "Dismissed, General." Mitchell saluted. It was returned with mechanical precision. He left the room knowing he hadn't been forgiven. He'd been tolerated. There was a difference, and it cut deeper than he wanted to admit. 3rd Canadian Infantry Division headquarters occupied a cluster of requisitioned manor houses in East Sussex. Mitchell arrived at 0545, 20 minutes early, determined to at least demonstrate punctuality. The duty officer directed him to a Spartan office where a major sat behind a desk writing in a logbook. The man didn't look up when Mitchell entered. "General Mitchell reporting as ordered." The major finished his entry, capped his pen, and finally raised his head. Mitchell saw the steel hook first. Where the major's left hand should have been, there was a curved prosthetic, gleaming dully in the morning light. Then he saw the face. Young, maybe 33, with the kind of hardness that combat stamps into men. Dark hair, grey eyes, a thin scar running from his left ear to his collar. "Major William Mackenzie," the man said, standing but not offering to shake hands. The hook made that gesture complicated. "I'll be your guide for the next month, General." He picked up a folder with his right hand. "Your quarters are with the junior officers. No special accommodations. You'll follow the same schedule as our training observers. Morning formation at 0600, physical training at 0630, breakfast at 0730. Daily training observations begin at 0800. Mackenzie's voice was flat, professional, completely devoid of warmth. "One more thing, General. That stupid hat you mocked." He gestured to the wedge cap hanging on a peg behind his desk. "I was wearing it when my platoon fought house to house in Ortona last December. 8 days of hell, lost 12 men, and my hand clearing German positions from buildings that had become tombs. The hat's still here, my hand isn't. But I suppose you have opinions about its practicality for combat." The question hung in the air like a blade. Mitchell felt something crack inside his chest. This wasn't an abstract debate about military fashion. This was personal. Every word he'd said, every casual dismissal, had landed on men who'd paid prices he couldn't imagine. "Major, Your quarters are in Building C, 2nd floor, room 12. Dismissed, General." Mackenzie sat back down, picked up his pen with his remaining hand, and returned to his logbook as if Mitchell had ceased to exist. Mitchell found his quarters. A small room with a single bed, a desk, a chair, and a window that looked out over the training grounds. He unpacked his kit in silence, hung his uniform in the narrow closet, and sat on the bed. For the first time in his career, General Lawrence Mitchell felt small. The first week was designed to break him. Mitchell understood that. The Canadians weren't cruel, weren't unprofessional, but they made sure he felt every moment of his punishment. Morning formation at 0600 meant standing in ranks with junior officers while a sergeant major called roll. Mitchell, a general officer, stood at attention like a second lieutenant, while rain soaked through his uniform. Physical training was worse. At 52, Mitchell was fit for his age, but the Canadian PT regimen had been designed for men half his age. After the first session, he could barely walk. Pride wouldn't let him request medical exemption, but it was the observations that truly began to change him. On the third day, Mackenzie took him to watch artillery training. Canadian 25-pounder field guns lined up in perfect spacing, crews moving with choreographed precision. Mitchell had commanded artillery units his entire career. He knew good fire control when he saw it. What he saw was exceptional. The forward observers called corrections with accuracy that rivaled anything he'd seen in American units. The Fire Direction Center calculated solutions faster than Mitchell would have thought possible. The guns themselves fired in sequence, creating walking barrages that would have torn advancing infantry to pieces. Mitchell found himself taking notes, real notes, not perfunctory observations. These were genuine technical observations from one professional to another. Mackenzie noticed, "Writing down our ineffective methods, General." The question had an edge, but not as sharp as before. Mitchell looked up from his notebook. "No, Major, I'm learning your fire control procedures are superior to standard American doctrine in several respects. The integration between forward observers and the Fire Direction Center is seamless. I've never seen better." It was the first honest thing he'd said since arriving. Mackenzie's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes shifted. "We've been doing this for 5 years, General. You learn or you die. Most of the men who made the mistakes are dead. The ones who survived taught the rest of us." That night, Mitchell wrote in his journal, not a required report, but a personal reflection. He wrote about the artillery, about the precision, about the quiet professionalism of men who'd learned their craft in blood. He also wrote about Mackenzie's hook and the wedding ring he'd noticed on it. A man who'd lost his hand but kept his ring on the prosthetic. It made the stupid hat comment feel even more shameful. The second week, Mackenzie took him to meet a man who would shatter what remained of Mitchell's comfortable certainty. They drove to a training facility where recruits were learning basic infantry tactics. In a small office overlooking the drill field sat an old man in uniform, very old. The insignia on his collar identified him as a regimental sergeant major, but the retired notation suggested he'd been brought back for the war effort. "General Mitchell," Mackenzie said, "this is Regimental Sergeant Major Angus McTavish." The old man stood. He moved carefully, the way men do when their joints protest every motion, but there was still steel in his spine. He had to be at least 65, maybe older. White hair, cropped military short. Eyes the color of winter clouds. A face that looked like it had been carved from oak and left in the weather for decades. "General," McTavish said. His accent was thick, Scottish by way of Nova Scotia. His handshake was surprisingly strong. They sat. Mackenzie remained standing by the door, arms folded. "The Major tells me you had questions about our headgear," McTavish said. Mitchell felt his face flush. "I made some inappropriate comments. I've apologized." "Aye, you apologize because Eisenhower told you to. But do you understand why it mattered?" Mitchell started to respond, but McTavish held up a hand. "Let me tell you about a hat, General. Let me tell you about April 9th, 1917. McTavish's eyes focused on something far beyond the walls of the office. "I was 27 years old. We were told to take Vimy Ridge. The British had tried for 2 years, lost thousands. The French had tried before that, lost thousands more. The ridge was considered impregnable. German positions carved into solid rock, machine guns covering every approach." His voice was quiet now, but it filled the room. "We attacked at 05:30 in the snow, 4 Canadian divisions. By the time we took it 4 days later, we'd lost 3,598 boys, dead. Another 7,000 wounded." McTavish paused. "But we took it, General. We took what the British Empire's finest couldn't take. Canadians took Vimy Ridge, and we held it." He reached behind his desk and pulled out a shadow box. Inside was a photograph, a young man in uniform, barely old enough to shave, standing proud. "My son Duncan, born 1919, enlisted 1939, the day Canada declared war." McTavish's voice didn't waver, but his hand trembled slightly. "Lieutenant Duncan McTavish. He went to Hong Kong in 1941, The Japanese attacked in December, outnumbered 5-1, no air support, no naval support, no hope. The old man set down the photograph. Duncan died in a POW camp in 1942. He was 22 years old. The Red Cross sent me his personal effects, his wedding ring, his dog tags, and his wedge cap. McTavish opened a drawer and pulled out a carefully folded piece of cloth. He unfolded it slowly, reverently. A wedge cap, faded and stained but still recognizably the same design Mitchell had mocked. "Every Canadian soldier who wears this hat carries our dead with them, General. They carry the weight of sacrifice. Vimy, Dieppe, Sicily, Ortona, every battle where boys became ghosts. And they carry Duncan. They carry my son." The old man looked directly at Mitchell. "You called it stupid. You called my son's honor stupid." Mitchell couldn't speak. His throat had closed. His eyes were burning. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "God, I'm so sorry." McTavish studied him for a long moment. "Tears don't bring Duncan back, General. They don't bring back any of the boys we've buried. But maybe they mean you're starting to understand." The old man carefully refolded the cap and placed it back in the drawer. "We don't ask for glory or recognition, we just ask to be respected for what we've done and what we're willing to do. That hat you mocked? It's about identity. It's about belonging to something bigger than yourself. It's about carrying forward the honor of men who died so others could live." McTavish stood. "Major Mackenzie will continue your education. I hope you learn well, General, because in a few months, men wearing those stupid hats are going to storm a beach in France. Some won't come back. The least they deserve is respect from the Allies fighting beside them." Outside in the jeep, Mitchell sat in silence. Mackenzie drove without speaking. Finally, as they approached division headquarters, the major spoke. "McTavish volunteered in 1939. He was 62 years old. They took him because we needed men who'd seen combat. He's trained 3,000 recruits, sent them all off to war, buried 247 when they came back in boxes." Mackenzie pulled the jeep to a stop. "Still think the hat is the problem, General?" Mitchell shook his head. He didn't trust his voice. That night, he wrote in his journal for 2 hours. About Duncan McTavish, age 22, about an old man who kept his dead son's cap in a desk drawer, about the weight of words carelessly spoken. He wrote, "I have been a fool, worse than a fool. I have been arrogant and blind. These men have paid prices I cannot comprehend, and I dismissed them with casual mockery." The fourth week, everything changed. Mackenzie woke Mitchell at 0500. "Get your gear, General. We're going to the beach." They drove to Bracklesham Bay on the south coast. The beach had been transformed into a rehearsal for invasion. Obstacles in the water, concrete bunkers on the high ground, machine gun positions covering every approach. At 0600, Canadian infantry began loading into landing craft. Mitchell watched from a command post overlooking the beach. He could see the wedge caps, hundreds of them, as men formed up and boarded the boats. "Full-scale rehearsal," Mackenzie explained. "As close to the real thing as we can make it. Live ammunition overhead, live explosives, real danger. Real." One platoon was led by a young sergeant, maybe 23, moving with the easy confidence of a veteran. He wore his wedge cap pushed back slightly, talking to his men, checking equipment, radiating calm leadership. "That's Sergeant Finley Thompson," Mackenzie said. "Ortona veteran, house-to-house fighting in December. His platoon cleared 14 buildings in 3 days, lost 7 men doing it. He's volunteered for the first wave at Juno Beach." At 0630, the landing craft turned toward shore. At 0645, machine guns opened fire. The sound was deafening. Tracers arced over the water. Artillery simulators detonated in the surf, throwing up columns of water and sand. The ramps dropped. The men poured out, and Mitchell watched something he'd never forget. They moved with organic precision born from endless practice and real combat. Fire teams advanced by bounds. Men went down, simulating casualties, and were immediately dragged to cover. Sergeants shouted orders, engineers blew gaps in the beach defenses. Thompson's platoon hit the beach and didn't stop. They moved through machine gun fire, through explosions, through chaos that would have frozen lesser units. In 42 minutes, they'd breached 3 defensive positions and established a secure beachhead. Mitchell had commanded men for 3 decades. What he'd just witnessed was exceptional. These weren't colonial amateurs. These were warriors who would have been elite in any army on Earth, and they were all wearing those wedge caps until the moment they hit the beach. After the exercise, Mitchell approached Thompson. "Sergeant Thompson." The young man turned, saw the stars on Mitchell's collar, and came to attention. "At ease, Sergeant. I watched your platoon. That was outstanding work." "Thank you, sir. The men train hard." Mitchell hesitated, then asked the question burning in his mind. "Why did you volunteer for the first wave at Juno Beach?" Thompson looked at him, measuring how honest he could be with a general officer. Then he seemed to decide that honesty was all that mattered. "Because someone has to go first, sir. Might as well be us. Canadians have always been first. Vimy Ridge, Dieppe, Sicily, Ortona. We don't wait for someone else to do the hard work." He pointed to the wedge cap tucked in his webbing. "This is going with me to France, sir, for my mates who didn't make it out of Ortona, for the boys who died at Dieppe. When I hit that beach, they'll be with me." Mitchell felt something break open inside his chest. "Sergeant, I said some things about those caps, about Canadian forces, things I had no right to say. I was wrong. Completely, utterly wrong." Thompson studied him, then nodded slowly. "We heard, sir. We also heard you've been with us for a month, learning. That matters more than words. Actions matter. You're here. You're watching. You're listening. That's all we ask." They shook hands. The sergeant's grip was firm, calloused. As Mitchell walked back to the jeep, he saw Mackenzie watching him. The major's expression was no longer hostile. Maybe not friendship, but no longer enmity. Maybe respect. "Well, General?" Mitchell looked back at the beach, at the men cleaning weapons, at the wedge caps visible everywhere. "I need to write a report to Eisenhower, a real one, about what I've learned, about what American forces could learn from Canadian doctrine and training." Mackenzie nodded. "There's hope for you yet, General." That night, Mitchell wrote for hours. Not an apology, not an excuse. A genuine analysis of Canadian military capabilities. Artillery doctrine that emphasized precision. Infantry tactics refined through 5 years of combat. Leadership development that created sergeants like Thompson and majors like Mackenzie. He wrote 15 pages, technical, professional, honest. And at the end, he wrote, "I came expecting to find colonial amateurs wearing ridiculous hats. I found professional warriors who have been fighting this war longer and harder than any American unit. We should learn from them. I know I have." He sealed the report and gave it to Mackenzie the next morning. "For General Eisenhower, through channels." Mackenzie read the first page and looked up with something that might have been approval. The general might actually survive his education. "Major, I need one more thing." "Sir?" "I need to meet with Colonel Harrison again, not because I was ordered to, because I owe him a real apology." Mackenzie studied him for a long moment. "I'll see what I can arrange." The meeting was arranged for 1800 hours on Mitchell's last day with 3rd Division. A small room, no witnesses, just 2 soldiers who needed to speak as men, not as ranks. Colonel James Harrison arrived exactly on time, service dress, ribbons telling a story of 2 wars. The scar on his cheek stood out white against weathered skin. His eyes were cautious, waiting. Mitchell stood when Harrison entered. "Colonel Harrison, thank you for agreeing to meet." Harrison nodded, took the offered chair. For a moment, neither spoke. Colonel, I need to apologize to you, not because General Eisenhower ordered it, not because it's expected, but because I owe you a debt I can never fully repay. Mitchell's voice was steady, but his hands weren't. A month ago, I mocked the symbol your soldiers wear. I called it stupid. I suggested it made you look ridiculous. I implied the Germans didn't take Canadian forces seriously because of a hat. He forced himself to meet Harrison's eyes. I didn't just insult a piece of cloth. I insulted everything that hat represents, every man who's worn it, every man who's died wearing it, 60,000 Canadians in the last war, thousands more in this one. I mocked their sacrifice. I dismissed their honor. I was an arrogant, ignorant fool. Harrison's posture shifted slightly, not forgiveness yet, but listening. This past month, Major Mackenzie has educated me. I've watched your artillery achieve precision I've rarely seen. I've observed infantry training that would rival any American unit. I've met Sergeant Major McTavish and heard about his son, Duncan. I've watched Sergeant Thompson lead men ready to die for each other. Mitchell's voice cracked. I understand now. The hat isn't stupid. I was. The hat is a symbol of identity, of belonging, of carrying forward the honor of men who gave everything. And I dismissed it with casual mockery because I was too arrogant to understand what I was looking at. He took a breath. Colonel Harrison, I am profoundly sorry, not just for the insult, but for my blindness, for my arrogance. You and your men have been fighting this war for 5 years. You've earned respect I failed to give. I can't undo what I said, but I swear to you, I will spend the rest of my career making sure others don't make the same mistake. 30 seconds of silence. Then Harrison spoke. General Mitchell, do you know why I walked out of that briefing room? Mitchell shook his head. It wasn't just because you insulted our uniform. It was because of what that insult revealed. It showed that you saw us as lesser. Colonial troops playing at soldier, amateurs who needed Americans to show us how real professionals operate. Harrison's jaw tightened. We'd been fighting since 1939, General. We were in France when it fell. We were in England during the Blitz. We crossed the Mediterranean and fought up Italy. We've learned lessons written in the blood of our friends, and you dismissed all of that because a hat looked odd to you. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer, but somehow more devastating. My younger brother was named Michael James Harrison, 2nd Lieutenant. He died at Passchendaele on October 30th, 1917. He was 19 years old. Mitchell felt his heart stop. They sent his personal effects home in a wooden box, his dog tags, his watch, his letters, and the cap he'd been wearing when a German shell tore him apart. Harrison's hands were flat on the table. My mother kept that box on the mantel for 21 years. Every day she'd touch it. Every night she'd say goodnight to Michael like he was still alive. When she died in 1938, she asked to be buried with it. I honored that request, but I kept Michael's photograph. I keep it on my desk. I look at it every morning. He looked directly at Mitchell. When you called our hats stupid, General, I saw Michael's face. I saw every boy I've watched die in 2 wars. I saw every funeral I've attended, every letter I've written to mothers explaining that their sons died well. I saw all of that, and I wanted to put you through the wall. Mitchell couldn't speak. Tears were running down his face. But I didn't, Harrison continued, because that wouldn't honor Michael's memory. So I walked out. And I waited to see what kind of man you really were beneath the arrogance. He stood, and Mitchell stood with him. This past month, Major Mackenzie has sent me reports about your training observations, about your questions, about your meeting with McTavish, about you watching Sergeant Thompson's platoon and understanding, finally, what you were looking at. Harrison extended his hand. General Mitchell, I accept your apology, the genuine one, because you've earned the right to offer it, not through words, but through actions. You could have gone through the motions and left unchanged. Instead, you let yourself be transformed. That takes courage. That takes character. Mitchell took the offered hand. The handshake became something more. Harrison pulled him into a brief, fierce embrace. Two soldiers, two men who understood loss and duty. When they separated, both men's eyes were wet. "Thank you," Mitchell whispered, "for not giving up on me, for giving me the chance to learn." "We're going to be fighting side by side in a few months," Harrison said. "On those beaches in France. I need to know the Americans next to us understand what we bring to the fight. Now I know at least one does." They sat back down, and for 90 minutes they talked, not as colonel and general, as soldiers, about D-Day planning, about beach assault challenges, about fear and leadership and the impossible burden of sending men into situations where many won't return. Finally, near midnight, Harrison stood to leave. "General, when this war is over, remember this month. Remember that a wise man is simply a fool who chose to learn." "I will, Colonel. I promise you I will." They shook hands one final time. Harrison left, and Mitchell sat alone, feeling lighter than he had in weeks. Not forgiven, perhaps, but understood. Not redeemed, but on the path to redemption. June 6, 1944, dawned grey and cold over the English Channel. General Lawrence Mitchell stood on the deck of the command ship off Omaha Beach, watching the coast of France appear through morning mist. Somewhere to the east, Canadian forces were loading into landing craft for the assault on Juno Beach. 14,000 men wearing wedge caps until the moment came to switch to helmets and storm into hell. Mitchell thought about Sergeant Thompson, about his platoon, about all the men he'd watched train for this moment. At 06:30, the naval bombardment began. Shells screamed overhead, slamming into the French coast. It was supposed to soften the defenses. Mitchell suspected it would mostly just wake up the Germans and make them angry. He was right. At 06:35, American forces began their assault on Omaha Beach. Within minutes, it became clear something had gone catastrophically wrong. The beach obstacles were more extensive than expected. The defenders were alert, ready, deadly. Mitchell watched through binoculars as men died on the beach, watched landing craft explode, watched soldiers struggling through water turned red with blood. Throughout the morning, fragmentary reports came in from other beaches. 0800 hours. Canadian forces engaged, heavy resistance, fortifications stronger than expected. 1000 hours. Casualties mounting at Juno. Canadians pushing forward. 1200 hours. Breakthrough at Juno. Canadian forces advancing inland. 1400 hours. Canadians 10 kilometers inland. Deepest penetration of all beaches. Mitchell stood on the deck, listening to these reports while watching American forces still struggling to get off Omaha Beach. The contrast was devastating. The men he'd mocked were succeeding. The men in stupid hats were doing what American forces couldn't. By evening, the picture was clear. Juno Beach had cost the Canadians 961 casualties. Heavy losses, terrible losses, but they'd achieved their objectives. They'd penetrated deeper into France than any other Allied force on D-Day. Omaha Beach had cost over 2,000 American casualties and had barely secured a toehold. Mitchell stood alone on the deck after dark, watching fires burn on the French coast, thinking about Thompson and McTavish and Mackenzie and Harrison. He pulled out his journal and wrote by flashlight. Today I watched soldiers I once dismissed prove themselves on the killing beaches of Normandy. They wore their wedge caps with pride until the moment steel met flesh. They earned every blood-soaked meter. They did what we struggled to do, and they did it with grace, under unimaginable pressure. I will carry this lesson to my grave. I was wrong. About everything, and they were magnificent. The war ground on through summer and fall. Canadian forces fought through Normandy, suffered terrible casualties at Verrières Ridge and Falaise Gap, and kept advancing. In August, at a forward headquarters near Falaise, Mitchell saw Colonel Harrison again. The colonel looked older, harder, marked by months of continuous combat. "How are your men, James?" "Tired. We've been in continuous action since June, lost too many, but we're still moving forward." "I saw the reports from Verrières Ridge. I'm sorry." Harrison nodded. That battle had cost the Canadians dearly. "Your boys at Omaha did well too, Lawrence." The use of first names felt natural now, earned through shared understanding. They talked for 20 minutes, comparing notes, discussing the push into Germany. "Stay safe, James." "You too, Lawrence. See you in Berlin." May 8th, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. Mitchell attended the ceremony at 3rd Division headquarters. He wasn't assigned there, but he'd requested permission. He wanted to see these men celebrate. The parade ground was filled with soldiers, thousands of wedge caps visible in the ranks, battered, faded, worn by men who'd survived campaigns across 2 continents. Mitchell spotted Sergeant Thompson. He was leaning on a cane, his left leg clearly damaged, but he was alive. The wedge cap was still on his head, blood-stained and faded. After the ceremony, Mitchell approached him. "Sergeant Thompson, good to see you made it." Thompson turned, recognized Mitchell and smiled. A tired smile, but genuine. "General Mitchell, didn't expect to see you here, sir."
I wanted to see you boys celebrate. You earned it." Thompson gestured to the cap on his head. "Still got the lucky hat, sir. Told you it would get me through." They shook hands. Mitchell noticed scars on Thompson's hands, burn marks on his neck. Juno Beach and all that followed had marked this young man permanently. "What will you do now, Sergeant?" "Go home to Alberta, sir. Try to be normal again. What about you?"
"Keep serving. Try to make sure we don't forget the lessons."
Thompson nodded. "We heard about the thing with the hats, sir. We also heard you spent a month with us learning. That mattered. Actions matter more than words. You showed up. You listened. You changed. That's all anyone can ask." Later that afternoon, Mitchell searched the crowd for other familiar faces. He found Major Mackenzie near the artillery park, overseeing equipment inventory. The steel hook still gleamed in the sunlight, but Mackenzie looked less haunted than he had a year ago, more at peace. "Major Mackenzie?" Mackenzie turned, saw Mitchell, and something like a smile crossed his face. "General, didn't expect to see you here." "Wouldn't miss it. Your boys earned this celebration." They shook hands, Mitchell's right gripping Mackenzie's right. "What's next for you, Major?" Mitchell asked. "Home to Nova Scotia, going to teach. High school history. Figure I've got enough stories to keep students awake." Mackenzie paused. "And I'm getting married in September. Girl I knew before the war waited for me, even after Ortona, even after—" He raised the hook slightly. "She sounds remarkable." "She is." Mackenzie looked at Mitchell directly. "You know, General, when you first arrived, I thought you were a hopeless case, another arrogant American who'd never understand. You were right. No, I was wrong. You became someone worth respecting. That's rare. Most men dig in when challenged. You let yourself change. That took guts." Mitchell felt his throat tighten. "I had good teachers. Thank you, William." The use of Mackenzie's first name felt earned. "Stay safe, General, and remember what you learned here." "Every day. I promise you, every day." Later that afternoon, Mitchell found Regimental Sergeant Major McTavish sitting alone on a bench, watching the celebrations from a distance. The old man looked even older now, weathered by another year of sending boys to war. Mitchell sat beside him without asking permission. "Sergeant Major." "General Mitchell, surprised you remember an old man."
I'll never forget you, Sergeant Major, or Duncan. McTavish nodded slowly. I'm going home next month. Back to Nova Scotia. They don't need old men anymore. War's over. What will you do? Tend my garden, visit Duncan's grave, try to remember the good times before the wars took everything. McTavish's voice was rough. I'm 70 years old, General. I've outlived my wife, my son, and most of my friends. I'm tired. You've earned your rest. Maybe, McTavish looked at him. But I'll tell you this, you were worth the effort. You came to us a fool. You're leaving a decent man. That's something. That matters. They sat in silence for a while, two old soldiers watching young men celebrate. Mitchell never saw McTavish again. The old sergeant major died in 1947, age 70, in his sleep. Mackenzie sent Mitchell a telegram. Mitchell attended the funeral in Nova Scotia, one of only 3 non-Canadians present. The years passed. Mitchell continued to serve. He was promoted to Lieutenant General in 1952, assigned to NATO Allied Forces Liaison. His reputation transformed. The officer who'd once struggled with coalition warfare became known as America's best coalition officer. In 1947, he published his memoir, Coalition Command: Lessons from the Crucible. Chapter 7 was titled The Education of an Ignorant General. 43 pages about Canadian forces, about wedge caps, about the month that changed his understanding of war and leadership. The book became required reading at West Point. The stupid hats incident became a case study in leadership, cultural humility, and redemption. Throughout the 50s and 60s, Mitchell and Harrison stayed in contact. Christmas cards, occasional phone calls, the friendship endured. In November 1975, Mitchell retired at 73. He'd served for 43 years, but when asked about his most important assignment, he always mentioned the month with 3rd Canadian Division. He settled in Charlottesville, Virginia, a small house with a study where he could write and remember. In March 1976, a package arrived from Ottawa. Mitchell opened it carefully. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, was a wedge cap, not new, vintage, from the war, worn, faded, carefully preserved. There was a letter. Harrison's handwriting, slightly shakier but still recognizable. Mitchell sat down to read. Lawrence, this wedge cap belonged to my brother Michael. It is not the one that was sent home after Passchendaele, that rests with our mother, but one I kept from the war. I have debated for 30 years whether to send this to you. You earned the right to hold it not through apology, but through transformation. In March 1944, you were a fool. By June 1944, you were a wise man. That journey, that willingness to shatter your own certainty and rebuild yourself as someone better, is rarer than battlefield courage. Keep this hat, Lawrence. When you look at it, remember, honor is not never making mistakes. Honor is having the spine to admit them and the character to change. I am 80 years old now. My health is failing. I wanted you to have this before I go. You have become more than an ally. You are my brother in arms, my friend. When you look at this hat, remember the men who wore it. Remember McTavish's son, Duncan. Remember Sergeant Thompson. Remember the boys who never came home. And remember that you honored them not by never making mistakes, but by having the courage to learn from them. Your brother in arms, James Harrison. Mitchell's hands shook holding the letter. Tears blurred his vision. He picked up the phone and called Harrison's number in Ottawa. A woman answered, Harrison's daughter. I'm sorry, General Mitchell. Father passed away 3 weeks ago. His heart finally gave out. The doctors said years of stress and combat had weakened it beyond repair. She paused, and Mitchell heard her voice crack slightly. In his final month, when he knew the end was coming, he spent every afternoon writing letters. He said there were things that needed to be said before he ran out of time. Yours was the last one he finished. He sealed it 2 days before he died.